We're proud to announce CISO Stories, a new podcast series in partnership with Cybersecurity Collaborative and Cyber Reason. CISO Stories features the candid perspectives and experiences of frontline senior security executives and dives deep into timely security topics. CISO Stories is hosted by Todd Fitzgerald, VP of Cybersecurity Strategy at Cybersecurity Collaborative, and Sam Curry, Chief Product and Security Officer at Cyber Reason. Listen weekly as they speak with extraordinary CISOs by visiting securityweekly.com/CSP.
Welcome back to Security and Compliance Weekly. We're having a riveting conversation with Evan Schuman, cybersecurity journalist. Before we jump back into it, I do have a few quick announcements to make. Sci-Hub Armenia, in cooperation with Security Weekly, is happy to announce its next batch of incubation program, which aims to supercharge the growth of early-stage cybersecurity startups. We're looking for founders from anywhere in the world to join us for a 3-month, mentor-driven, 100% virtual program. The best teams will have the opportunity to get up to $50,000 in funding, and then we'll do everything we possibly can to make them successful. Visit securityweekly.com/acceleration to apply now. Also, coming up on our next live webcast, which is December 2nd, you're going to see what's under the XDR hood. Visit securityweekly.com/webcast to save your seat. And don't forget to check out our library of on-demand webcasts and technical trainings at securityweekly.com/on-demand. All right. I cut Tyler off right before the break. So Tyler, I'm going to flip it right to you.
No problem. I was just thinking through, I think there is a little bit more to the problem outside of resource. I think you're spot on. There's a lot of CFOs and there's a lot of companies that have not dedicated enough money because we're just getting to the point where we have enough awareness that money and budgetary items have to come down the pipe for security. But I think the issue that you were alluding to earlier is the difference between cybersecurity professionals, which oftentimes are engineers at heart, and so you lose that lack of creativity. So we end up having a gap of people that have the hacker mindset or even just the offensive mindset where that creativity comes in, people that are not engineers. Getting from point A to point B with some very strict guidelines as an engineer or even a security engineer, that's a pretty straightforward path. Even if you think outside the box, it's still in pretty black and white letters and in a straight direction. As a hacker, you don't have a lot of those limitations, and you tend to often think a little more evil, where you abuse things that other people wouldn't even conceive as a possible avenue to try. Things well outside the box of creativity. So I think there's a gap of those long-term hackers and kind of the thing that you can't teach, the instincts around the creativity. So you have a shortage of resources, and then the fact that we've got a shortage of money being devoted to those resources and a very short supply of the people that actually need to come in and offer creativity to each of these companies, which then we have vendors that are not coming up with products that are creative, they're engineers. And so we're trying to solve engineering problems with engineering people and products. And therefore, you end up with this disparate hacker kind of creativity gap that is not being addressed in the general sense for security as a whole. And I think that's where our major gap is. Hackers are going to continue hacking and doing cool, creative things. And we're still going to try and solve those problems with engineering and applications and blinky boxes or even compliance. And that doesn't necessarily address the issue.
Well, let me offer you a couple of quick thoughts. First of all, the creativity in security is being done by some entities. Bizarrely enough, NSA is very good at encouraging their people to think creatively. You've got to outthink these people. They also have substantial resources, but they do encourage creative thinking in a way that a Boeing or a Walmart do not. And that's the problem, because those companies, particularly Boeing, I just mentioned them just as an example, you're dealing with nation states at that level, and you've got to think creatively. Yes, you have to resource it appropriately, but you've got to think of non-obvious items. And I would disagree. I would disagree in that engineers left to their own devices, as a group, they can be very creative. I have seen engineers, when they're given the freedom to do so, or whether they're given the mandate to do so, they can be very creative. Vendors, however, tend not to be creative, and it's not just engineering created products, it's engineering and marketing created products, and they tend to address a problem that happened 2 years ago, and they productize this one capability. They tend to be always behind the curve because that's how vendors think. So I think that's another problem there. The other thing I would throw out, and this is old school, I will admit to this, that I use terms like cyber criminal, bad guys, etc., cyber terrorists. I will not use hacker as a synonym for a thief, because hacker is a time-honored programming term referring to a creative coder who comes up with non-traditional ways to get out of it. So I think we need hackers, the good kind, the old definition, who are very good. Oh, we have very few. We've got to do this by Thursday. Let's get Karen on. She's an excellent hacker. She'll figure out a way to do this by Thursday somehow. And so I push back on the term, but everything else I agree with.
I think everybody should push back on that term, and I think we've been trying to capture that quite a bit, referring to people as criminals where it's criminal, and hackers, and bring back the term that there was that disparate point in the early 90s where, crackers tried to take off, and that has its own connotations. It didn't work out. But no, I think you are kind of right. Like the vendor problem, like you've got a board of directors, you're trying, as a capitalist company, you're trying to make money. You've got a VC that you're trying to recoup money from, a board of directors you're trying to get a product to market to. So there are issues where you are behind, and the engineer is at the liberty of what the company's vision is. So there's a ton there that can come from the top down and help affect that change by being a little bit more creative and allowing the autonomy to the engineers to come up with more creative solutions. But still, that only solves a small portion of that problem, I think. And I think we're at that point where we're starting to feel the effects of a lot of the old school people that have come up and had to kind of know everything and figure out how to do everything outside the box. And we've got the new generation that's coming down through maybe more traditional schooling that has cybersecurity as a focus. And those two merging is at a point where we're still trying to adapt and adopt different methods in order to combat and actually keep up with things. There's nation states that do this very well, and we end up with a problem where government has the siloed effect and low pay, but they're doing cool creative things against adversaries and making a difference, so they got a good mission. Then we have the commercial side that has better pay, but it's not doing creative, interesting work and has no mission or soul. So those two are not matching, and you end up with people on both sides of that end up going back and forth and really never making a difference in either area.
No, absolutely. I mean, another security area that we haven't touched on, which I think is crucial, is the whole approach of embedding security people in other business units, which addresses or tries to address the bigger issue, which is one of the big problems most enterprises have, is that they've got a security team who are very good, very well trained, very experienced, very intelligent, and that's it. And the whole rest of the company doesn't really focus on security. We'll just do, in theory, whatever security tells us. Well, in most cases, they won't. But you've got to start training everyone to do a security, because it's everybody else outside of cybersecurity. They're going to be the victims of phishing attacks. They're going to open up the holes. They're going to create the backdoors inadvertently. So training everyone in the company to think, or at least be aware of, the cybersecurity implications of their actions is crucial. And I think that's been given lip service. I don't think it's really happening to the extent that it needs to. And if everyone in a Walmart or a Nike or a Hilton, if all of those employees all internalized core cybersecurity concepts enough that they could get themselves out of trouble, that would be a huge help. But at the moment, I just don't think we have that. But I'd throw that up to the panel. How far along you think we've gotten with that?
I blame security awareness training companies, honestly. Like what we're doing for corporate security awareness and the requirement that's there already. Like we have the requirement that's adopted. Everybody knows what security. My grandma knows what security is and security awareness and cyber is. She knows what phishing is. Like so, we've gotten the term out there. The general public is in the know, understands the implications of security and what hacking and criminal activity is. But we're still not training them in a way that actually makes a difference. So I put a lot of the onus on what we're training end users to, and really not building a culture in companies. By telling people what security is, that hasn't helped. That's like telling people what phishing is, and they're still hungry. Right? We go back to a lot of the old, nuances of what the prophetic things were, but really understanding and adopting a security culture so that everyone is involved, has interest, and is invested personally and professionally to make a better security decision, both personal and professional. Once we get to that stage, that's when companies start to change and we start to actually see the awareness take effect and things actually make a difference. But by teaching people, go hover over this link, like half the time I hover over the link, I can't tell you if it's evil without a whole bunch of technical backing and looking at things. So we're not teaching anybody anything with all these security awareness trainings that are required and mandatory. So I think we need to shift how we're doing this and really get the culture of security built into the companies from the bottom up and the top down.
I mean, your mouse over comment is interesting because that's one of the things that I've harped on in the computer world column, that a lot of the functionality that exists on the desktop is miniaturized in a mobile environment. And the bottom line is you're going to see a lot less information there. So you're going to be much more susceptible to attacks. At least if you know what to look for, you have a fighting chance on a desktop or a laptop to see, wait a minute, this is not coming from Chase Manhattan. This is coming from somewhere else. You have much less of an ability to see that on an Android or an iPhone. And as more and more communication shifts to those mobile devices, this problem is just going to get worse. So I would love for the mobile OS people to think about that and to try to make security checks easier at that level.
No, I agree, and I think the mobile platform is a more secure platform by default, just because of the proliferation of it. But that doesn't lend itself to easy checks and balances. If something gets through and makes it to your mobile platform, you automatically think it's either not a risk because it's developed for a desktop, or if it does get through, it's not going to do anything and it's just spam. Like we get used to getting spam SMS, and that's not a big deal. Like it doesn't do anything to us. So we really are at that point where people trust their mobile devices more than they do their computers, because computers have been targeted and attacked. And I think we're at that point where the attackers have moved to mobile platform a long time ago, and they're not just strictly sticking to mobile platform. They're combining all of these. You've got phishing, you've got mobile platform, you're following it up with an MFA token request that is asking for an SMS that happened, 10 seconds prior to that off of a password reset that then allows them into your desktop application. So the fact that we're at a point where the mobile is just hooked in, and security awareness and or end users are 5 or 10 years behind because we're not training them on all these new tactics, we can't keep up. Again, this goes back to, we need to train people and get the culture of security in place, but we also need to have technological bumpers for the end user that shouldn't have to worry about thinking about all this stuff. I don't want my grandma to have to worry about whether the SMS she got from a spoof number is really her grandson or not.
No, absolutely.
This is turning into the Tyler Robinson interview.
Oops,
Drop
sorry.
down, Tyler. That's okay. A more generic question for you, Evan, but sort of along the theme of what Tyler is espousing. Again, from your perspective, which I think is somewhat, at least from my opinion, it's a somewhat unique perspective. Granted that we need to do more at some level, is the more needing to come from, and I'm going to use the old paradigm of people process technology. I guess is that fair? And if it is fair, where do you think we're most deficient? Where do you think we're doing well from a people process technology perspective?
Well, I think to the point that's already been discussed, there is general awareness of the main attack vectors, but they're not. I think that is good, and that's obviously step one. But I don't think they're thinking about it creatively enough. And the example I gave before is a good example. They know to be suspicious of texts and emails that you didn't expect. But if the attacker sets it up in that way with the password changing mechanism, where they say you're going to see a text from us here, we're Chase Manhattan, and of course they're not, and the text comes through, that seems to qualify. And so their level of understanding is not sophisticated enough to really hit the attack. So that's why I mentioned earlier, I think training, and I absolutely agree, the training out there is, I'll be nice and say subpar, which is a nice way of saying sucks. But I think that people are not aware of that outside of the IT department, and certainly outside of security. The SOC, and obviously the CISO's overall jurisdiction. So I think those are the big issues. I'm not sure if that's where you were going with the question.
Well, I mean, I have an opinion, certainly, but I was trying to get a little bit of your feel. I mean, I grew up in the DoD. I cut my teeth in the DoD, where I worked for an organization whose name was information security. So it was kind of what we did. It was kind of part of the culture. Might have been part of a certain 3-letter agency you mentioned a little while ago. I personally think that so many of us that came out of that world and came into the private sector, for lack of effort notwithstanding, have done a fairly poor job of translating the need for security becoming part of a culture of an organization, rather than, and this is where I waffle a little bit, and I'm interested in your perspective, between trying to convince companies and organizations to think more seriously about security versus sort of getting caught up in the whole industrial marketing industry hype of have to have the latest and greatest blinky box with the flashiest lights, and it's it's all about the latest tech. It's all about the latest tech, which I think feeds into a mentality that I certainly see with my clients, is that security is not something that should be embraced by an organization. Security is something that somebody else is doing for me in an organization. It's not my table. It's not my responsibility. Somebody's got this covered. Therefore, I don't have to worry about my actions or inactions. Do you see that at all? Do you have a different take on that? What's your perspective?
Oh, I absolutely see that, and I find it ludicrous. It's happening. You're absolutely right. But it's akin to someone in a community saying, well, we've got an excellent police department that our taxes pay for, so I don't need to lock my door at night, and I don't need to be aware of any suspicious strangers, that we've got a good police force, we're fine. It doesn't work that way. Every person has to do something for their own security, their own protection. Any security department, even if they got the funding that I think is appropriate, like anyone's asking me. But even if they did that, no security department can be in everyone's head. So yes, employees have to be vigilant on their own. And the idea that security is someone else's problem, that attitude is the best gift we could give to a cyber thief.
Interesting. No, I certainly agree with that. What is your biggest pet peeve, marketing campaign / buzzword phrases, misconceptions about cybersecurity space these days? Things that you just get you irritated when you hear them or read them.
Well, we've only got 3 hours. So I don't know if I could answer that question comprehensively. But I will say that the line that I thought we put the stake through the heart of many years ago is still coming up. I'm still getting pitches which are predicated on the assumption that if you do this, you will be secure. And I have to explain to people that, okay, I don't care what you're doing. And the fact that you think this will deliver perfect security is all I need to know to like delete your message and move on with my sorry life. But the fact is, no, as everyone knows, nothing can be secure. And yet vendors who absolutely should know better are continuing to pitch their offerings. If you do this, an attacker cannot get through. Oh, really? Let's try that and see how that holds up. You can say it improves security. That's certainly a valid claim. You can say lots of things, but when I get someone pitching that this will make X and Y secure and no one can break in, they've lost me, because I believe that is an unattainable state. And I don't want to be a purist on it, but yeah, I do believe that. So that's my biggest pet peeve. And I swear to God, I did not expect to still be hearing that in 2021, but alas, I do.
Yeah, I mean the PCI equivalent of that I hear, and I was responding to something that somebody wrote about it on Twitter. Just I think it was over the weekend, but somebody made some offhanded comment about some company doing something really stupid. In this case, it had to do with physical security, and they're like, somebody was mocking it, but we were PCI compliant. Why is this a problem? And to which I responded, why do people think that PCI compliance means you're secure and you won't be breached, when a whole major section of the PCI standard has to do with collecting event logs and putting them on a centralized logging server so that you have evidence retained so you can do a forensic exercise? That to me kind of assumes a breach.
Well, first of all, I will put that blame squarely on Visa. That Visa, among others, but Visa was the most egregious. For the longest time, they actually put out slides that no one who has been truly PCI compliant has ever been breached. And it was a delightful piece of utopian thinking, because there was a reason they could say that accurately. They could say it accurately because they made damn sure that anyone who was breached would be re-examined, and lo and behold, turns out they weren't actually PCI compliant. Why? Because they were breached. Really? So there'd be this delightful black is white scenario that they would go through to defend this absurd thought. So yeah, they helped put out the idea that PCI meant a lot more than it meant. So I think that's where a lot of that thinking started.
Yeah, that's true too. I mean, they're the ones that had the whole PCI PFI program, the PCI Forensics. And the goal of I think at the time when 403 Labs started entering that space, it was, they were like the 9th person on this list, and Visa was actually opening it up and kind of handing that program off to the PCI Council. But originally, when you were breached, that was a Visa program, and you would have to, on this list of like 4 or 5 vendors, pick one of them who had been given the, okay, do forensics, find where it came out, all that kind of stuff, and figure out which requirement it was that they violated. Like, that was like totally a thing, at least back then.
I mean, that forces me to say I've got a variety of pet peeves with PCI. Let me stress, it's better than what it replaced, which was, very, very little. So it does good, but let's just not make it into more than it is. And the problem is that a lot of executives, and I'm not talking about CISOs or CIOs, I'm talking about CEOs and COOs and chief legal counsel, those kind of people. And they assume PCI it's sort of like an insurance policy that, yes, I want to be PCI compliant, so that if we're breached, I can go to the board and I can go to the media and I can go to our lawyers and say, but we were compliant when we were breached, which of course will never, ever, ever happen. Not just the reverse logic that we talked about a moment ago, but that's not how PCI works. PCI works that it's now, so today is November 23rd. So PCI, the QSA came and they visited, it was September 1st through the 4th, let's say. And when you get your letter later on indicating that you were compliant, all they're saying is that to the best of our knowledge, and we'll pull back if you're breached, but to the best of our knowledge, you were compliant back in the first few days of September. So we're breached. We were breached 2 days ago under this scenario. It doesn't help. It's like, no, you weren't compliant then. All we said is that as far as we can tell, you were compliant when we were there, which was September 1st through 3rd or whatever. So it doesn't give them anything. It doesn't give them we were compliant when we were breached. It's the best they could say is we were compliant 2.5 months before we were breached. So it doesn't mean anything. So I think that's the problem. People assume that PCI compliance is more than it is. And
usually the people that assume that, right? The people that assume that are usually ones that are uneducated around what PCI actually does and what it actually means. Like it is the people that are saying, well, you were PCI compliant and you still got breached, so therefore PCI compliance, it doesn't work and is not secure. That usually is an indication of their level of education around what PCI compliance assessments look like, what they're actually trying to accomplish, and where they actually fit in. Like there's compliance for SOX, there's compliance for HIPAA. All of these compliance have very specific goals that may or may not align completely with being secure. Typically, they tend to lend themselves to security in general, but doesn't necessarily fix the problem of breaches or hackers or attacks. It helps on the mitigation. It helps on the detection, time to mitigation, the remediation, all of the things that do matter within security. And it's not necessarily just the defense and stopping of those attacks. So again, I think it's just a lack of education around people's understanding of what compliance is for in each vertical. PCI tends to get more hammered on than any of them, but that's, like you said, goes back to a lot of the card companies and what their propaganda was in the early days.
I mean, let me be candid, and anyone disagree, please jump in. But all that PCI is, let's not make it onto more than it is. It's simply best practices, which by the time they hammer it out, are best practices from 6 months to a year before they release them. It's fine. I mean, it's fine. It tells you things you should do. But if you're really on your game in cybersecurity, you're going to look at that and say, yeah, we should have done this 2 years ago. There's nothing. It's just best practices. That's really all it is. And the sooner you accept that, the sooner you realize, oh, so it's not this big, no, it's not a big thing at all. It's just best practices. This is stuff you should have done anyway. And we're just saying to be compliant at some point, this is what we want you to do. I mean, is that overstatement?
Well, so I have to jump in since I'm the PCI guy. It's not overstatement. It's certainly a particular perspective, and I don't think the card brands have done well to educate people. I think the council on one level understands the need to better educate, and on another level they tend to promulgate the mismessaging from the card brands because I wonder why. I mean, I've been a QSA off and on since before it was called QSA. I've been doing PCI since before it was PCI back in 2004. I've always approached the PCI standard, yes, as a set of best practices. One of the things that frustrates me when people talk about it being a point-in-time assessment is, quite a few of the things that I'm assessing is, do you have programs in place? Do you have processes in place where you're doing things daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, every 6 months, and so on and so forth? And if I'm getting to the point where I'm saying, yep, you're good with that, it sort of implies that you're not treating this as a point-in-time assessment anyway. And that is often largely lost because for whatever reason, PCI seems to have devolved into not checking off whether we're meeting all these basic, table stakes security fundamentals that an organization should do. It's devolved into very often, how do we avoid this? How do we make PCI go away? We were talking about tokenization earlier, and that's sort of given way to the craze now is encryption. And encryption, according to the council, has to be done in a very specific way to make things go away from do we have to put you through all the paces of evaluating all these PCI controls? And there's a whole lot of companies and organizations that are latching onto that, and for whatever political reasons, they try to claim that their products are doing just as much as or just as well as the very defined, if you do this very specifically, yes, you can have some relief on what you're going to be assessed against. But I have a current client right now that's been operating for years under the perception, because a vendor told them it's not card data. You're not dealing with card data anymore because we almost quite literally applied some magic wiffle dust to your card data, and therefore it's going to go away. And I'm the first QSA that's come in and has said, well, wait a minute, what they're saying doesn't really make a lot of sense, doesn't hold water, and certainly doesn't hold up to any of the established guidelines and recommendations and requirements that the PCI Council puts out. So guess what? All this belief that none of your systems are in scope and you have very minimal responsibilities for PCI just blew up. You've got to do all of it, or you've got to figure out a way to eliminate this thing that you're doing that puts you in scope for all of PCI. So my big frustration is to echo what Tyler said, is so many people having a misunderstanding and a misrepresentation of PCI, up to and including the card brands and the PCI Council, frankly, most of the time. I'll get off my soapbox now.
No. It's a fine soapbox. Another consideration is, let's beat up a different compliance rule. Let's beat up GDPR, which God knows deserves it. Okay. So I had to do a deep dive a few years ago when it first started into GDPR. And I'm looking into this. I'm saying, has anyone really looked at GDPR? I mean, actually read the lines and really thought them through? Because GDPR is the Swiss cheese. My favorite GDPR requirement is, have you ever looked really closely at their data breach disclosure rule? And so, oh yeah, it's very simple. It's 3 days. It's like, take a look at it more closely. And what their rule says is that if there is a breach, when the company is aware of the breach, within 72 hours, you must report it. And I'm looking at that. I'm saying, hold on. So let's say the company is Nabisco. When does Nabisco know anything? If you had said when the CEO believes it or first hears about it, that's a point in time. But literally, when does Nabisco know any piece of information? And how are you going to prove that later? What does that mean? Does that mean when the CEO and the CISO learns of it? Does that mean when the CISO is convinced of it? And how do you determine what moment they're convinced of anything? There was no attempt. They defined everything else except the fundamental, what the heck does it mean for a company, a $70 billion company, to know something? So yeah, they say 72 hours, but the clock starts from an amorphous, unknowable data point. So it really means nothing. That kind of stuff is all throughout GDPR, where if you read it very closely, it doesn't actually say what it sounds like it says.
I'm not going to disagree with you. Are you going to give us more? What does it say? What do people think it says?
Well, they think it says 72 hours, but they all define 72 hours from what differently? Oh, yeah, I learned about it last Tuesday. So that's when the clock starts. So you're learning about it means that all of Nabisco, and I don't mean to pick on Nabisco, just had to come up with some company, but all of Nabisco knows it at the same moment. what is, is this like a Borg concept where they know things instantly? But I had to work some Star Trek reference in there. But yeah, I think people in compliance, and I deal with compliance a lot. Unfortunately, I believe that's because I was a mass murderer in a prior life. That's my only theory. It's a working theory. But I deal with compliance a lot, and you've got to read the original document, read it carefully, and actually think through what it really says. Because the quick casual, it's 3 days from when you learn of it, like, what does that actually mean? And what does the requirement say? So for what it's worth, I would throw that out. We were picking on PCI so much, I felt we were neglecting GDPR. We have to pick on them too.
Fair enough. And I was going to make a PCI analogy to what you're saying. Most commonly, it comes up to in terms of patching. The PCI requirement says install critical security patches within 30 days of release. Many companies are, in theory, installing patches 30 days after they find out about it from the scan report. And God knows how long the vulnerability has been out there, how long it's been published, and how long the patch has been available. But
I think if people would just realize the why, right? Like, that goes back to you, Jeff, like the why, if you would realize why the patches are being installed or why there's a 72-hour response involved. The why is the real reason. We're going back to behavior and tackling security from a behavior, or the why it matters. If we take that and use that with inside the compliance mindset, I think it would actually drive security more than many of the other security things we do.
Well, I agree with that because, that's been my modus operandi for the 25 years I've been consulting in the private sector. Explain what the rules mean, explain what the requirements mean in such a way that people go, oh, yeah, that makes sense. We should do that. Let's figure out how to do it. Because it's not that complicated. Is it hard to do? Does it cost money? Do you have to prioritize? Yes. And you can only go so far without doing the real security things, which in my opinion is, the monitoring and the paranoia and looking for the weird, the broken, the unusual, the anomalous, because all that other stuff that we spend so much time in theory doing, to me isn't even really security at all. It's just part of your IT admin developer function. But that's my opinion. Evan, any other grounds you want to cover that we haven't, you were like hoping we'd ask you a question and bring up?
I don't know. When you and I talked the other day, you came up with a bunch of really interesting questions. I didn't write them down.
Questions.
So I have no idea if that list is still here.
I have one more question for you, based on our earlier discussion. Do you have any passions right now, pet projects, things that you're working on that you're excited to talk about? What's exciting you today in terms of projects?
Nothing.
Good answer.
I got excited about a project last, I think it was 1989, and it hasn't happened since, so I'm still waiting.
You are truly a curmudgeon and cut from the same cloth. Well, if that's the case, we should probably think about wrapping things up for the day. Evan, thank you for joining us. I do appreciate you taking the time. We've had a very interesting discussion. I probably should have mentioned it to you, and I've been remiss. We actually run a Discord server while we're broadcasting. There's been quite a lot of discussion over there. No specific questions aimed at you. I would have flipped them over, but you have generated a lot of discussion amongst some of our listeners that happen to join in on the Discord server. So appreciate that. Hopefully this is, the goal of this show is to help people think differently and try to move the ball down the field a little bit, to use a sports analogy. I'll give you, one last chance. Any parting thoughts? Anything you want to leave to us and our audience, Evan?
Well, sure. I mean, the one thing I have as a journalist, as a content creator, whatever you want to call what I do, is my big thing is that so many security companies, and let's limit it for the moment to cybersecurity. As I said, I get pitches from these folk all the time, and it is stunning how incredibly lame so much of this is, meaning that the percentage of pitches that are just telling me something blindingly obvious it's just astronomical. It's 99.9, and I'm going to probably say 99.9 repeating. They're just stating what we already know. It's like, really, if you want coverage, tell me something that our readers don't know, which I argued earlier. That's it. It's nothing more complicated than that. And they just don't. And they say, a lot of vendors say that they very much want to be into thought leadership. I say, great. Tell me some thought leading thoughts. What do you got? And generally they have very little, if anything.
Right.
And I'm going, so you don't really want thought leadership. You want, I don't know, blindingly obvious stuff, which you're very good at. I applaud you. But that's not going to get you anywhere. So my counsel to any cybersecurity companies is think outside the box. If you want media coverage, tell them something their readers don't already know. It's that simple. If you start there, you will be light years beyond all of your competitors, because that's just about everything I see. So that's my offering for cybersecurity companies out there. If you want coverage, you gotta tell them something they don't already know.
Well, you heard it from somebody that's been in the business for a long time. So we'll leave it there. That's going to wrap for us this week. Next week, we'll be back and we'll actually be talking to a real hacker, someone that has earned the title. And he actually reached out to me because he wanted to have a conversation about, and we sort of touched on it today on a couple things that Tyler said, but just this whole sense that something's wrong in the cybersecurity community. The person that's joining us next week is John Threat. He was on a previous episode back in, I think, like February. Old school OG hacker, grew up in Brooklyn, one of the original members of the Masters of Doom. And he wants to talk about what's missing in the cybersecurity world. His take is there's not enough people thinking like hackers anymore, which, you know, we mentioned on today's show. It's sort of that lack of imagination, the lack of what could be done here, what could be exploited here. So hopefully that piques your interest. Hopefully you'll join us next week. Until then, no show tomorrow, no PSW. Have a great Thanksgiving, those of us in the United States. We'll see you next week. Stay secure, stay compliant, and keep building those bridges and tearing down those silos. We're out.